Good evening. I'm Deirdre Cross, Director of Public Programs at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. I'd like to welcome you to tonight's program entitled Historically Speaking, Reclaiming Reconstruction and Its Legacies by Kinshasha Holman Conwill and Paul Gardullo, a compilation of essays by the nation's foremost historians. The text is the companion to the museum's newest exhibition entitled Make Good the Promises, Legacies of Reconstruction. I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Carr, who will begin and moderate tonight's conversation. Greg Carr is an associate professor of Afro American Studies at Howard University and has served as department chair for 12 years. He is also an adjunct professor at the Howard University School of Law. He is the first vice president of the Association for the Study of Classical African Civilizations and editor of The Compass, the journal of this association. His writing has appeared in books, academic, and popular journals, and he serves as a contributor to and commentator for a wide range of media. We look forward to a great conversation this evening. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Didra, and thank you everyone involved at the museum. What a wonderful exhibit! Get a chance to go down, and this companion book. Everyone needs to get it. Everyone needs to get this book. Make good the promises, and make sure you visit. Um, we're going to start. I'm going to introduce everyone, beginning with the editors of the companion volume, Make Good the Promise, and are two of the contributors. And we're going to have a very interesting conversation about perhaps the most significant moment in American history, Reconstruction. And so, with that in mind, we'll hear first from the editors, as I said, Kinshasa Holman Conwill, who is the deputy director of the museum and former director of the Studio Museum of Harlem. She's organized more than 40 exhibitions and often writes on arts, museum, and cultural policy. Has done a number of texts, co-editor of Ain't Nothing Like the Real Thing on the Apollo Theater, and a number of other pieces, up to and including the last major exhibition I was honored to able to have conversation on, and that was, of course, We Return Fighting on World War One. And she'll be joined with Paul Gardullo, who is, among many other things, project director for Make Good the Promises and curator of history at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. Director of the museum's Center for the Study of Global Slavery, which is important. It's the only way to study it is globally. Co-author of From No Return, the 221-year journey of the slave ship Sao Jose. You all know that if you've been to the museum, particularly on the first floor. And a little bit later, we're going to bring in Hasan Jeffries, my brother from Ohio State University and teaches African American history, the author of the very important book, Bloody Lounge, Free All Political Prisoners. I'll slip that in. Frequently shares research on the Black experience and does a lot of work, public facing work, a public historian, teaching that hard history. Um, and also our sister Kidada Williams, who is at Wayne State. I'm sorry, brother Jeffries, the Ohio State University. She's at the Ohio State University, and joined, of course, by Kidada Williams. Dr. Williams is at Wayne State University in Detroit, the author of They Left Great Marks on Me, African American Testimonies of Racial Violence from Emancipation to World War One. And in the wake of the murders at Mother Emanuel AME in Charleston, was one of the forces that pulled together the Living Charleston Syllabus, the book and companion work, which was a crowd-sourced project that gave us the kind of resources and tools we need to think through and teach and learn about racial violence. And so we'll be talking about your chapters in a minute, and I'm going to go directly now to Kinshasa and Paul. And at the beginning, and well, no, actually near the end of the companion volume, you say that this work involves a nuanced articulation of the contours of this vexed subject. That really caught my attention, that word vexed, because this is one of the most complicated moments really in modern world history. And so I'll start with a very basic question to both of you. And that is, what are we reconstructing? What are we reconstructing, and what are some of the factors that went into the decision making process that had you not only convene this exhibition, but convene these scholars to put together this companion.
I think, Greg, we are in the footsteps of Dr. Du Bois, whose Black Reconstruction in America has that great title, right? Toward a history of the part which Black people played in the attempt to reconstruct democracy in America. So we're trying to reconstruct democracy. We're trying to reconstruct the story of Reconstruction and overturn the false narratives about Reconstruction. And we're doing that with the wonderful people on this panel and also an array of other scholars, including Eric Foner, probably the leading scholar of Reconstruction, who introduces the volume, Spencer Crew, one of the co curators of the exhibition, and Thavolia Glimpf, and the wonderful, they're all wonderful, but Kimberly Crenshaw, who genders the story in a way that gives us another lens through that story. Also, our very own Mary Elliott, who is the curator of American slavery at the museum, and Catherine Franke. And through the writing of these brilliant writers, we are able, through different lenses, to look at different aspects of this story and to unpack it, to interrogate it, to challenge the received narrative that for many, many decades uh, perpetuated in major universities, including Columbia University, where the Dunning School was one of the perpetrators of that story. And Professor Jeffries can tell you a lot about that. We're at the intersection of, of faith and belief. We're at the intersection of truth and falsehood. We're at the intersection of all the freedom stories of Black people on the continuum from the moment that African Americans, as Africans, came to these shores. And we wanted to capture this story. And my brother Paul, who I've come to, if I could love him even more, I didn't think I could until I worked on this book. And now I'm done. I'm done. Totally enthralled uh, by Paul Gardullo. But we wanted to continue the story, which Paul will tell you more about, of the museum, the National Museum of African American History and Culture, whose foundation is the freedom story of slavery and freedom. It's not only the story of its horrors, it's its stories of its liberatory moments, of its resistance, and this book is suffused with that courage, with that dignity, and even in the worst moments, you will hear stories when you read the book, when you see the exhibition that we just talked about in the green room, incredibly painful, very painful to look at and to think about. But as Professor Williams said, we don't want to look away. We want to, as Dr. Maya Angelou tells us, to face that truth, right? With courage, and so that it need not be lived again. And every author of the book, including those gathered here and those not here, talk about how this book and the exhibition have lessons. So the whole point of this is not just to say this is Reconstruction, but to say what can Reconstruction tell us today? What can the murder of George Floyd speak backwards in history to Reconstruction and enslavement? And what can all of this speak forward as we look to create a more just society?
I appreciate that. Appreciate that, Kinshasa. In fact, having watched you work over the years and been one of your students, not only through reading but listening and watching how you interact. Remember, as the museum was being built, the day that they lowered the train car in, and standing beside you there with your brothers and sisters who had brought the car up from the south and listening to that conversation. And I think often not only about your work cataloging how black people have represented themselves. And one of the things in the exhibit, it was quite striking for me, was um, the fact that black people have been telling their own stories for a long time. And I wonder, as someone who has taken on, in part, the responsibility of not only uh, building this museum, but convening for what for a lot of visitors, I imagine, I know it is for me in part, a shrine. What kind of emotional journey did you take on this project, which is so complicated and involves so many stories, sometimes conflicting stories? I mean, what kind of things went through your mind as you, and spirit, emotionally, as you tried to figure out what ways you could create points of entry for folk to engage this narrative?
Is this for Paul or for
Oh, that's
me?
for you. It's for you.
Oh, okay. Oh
And then we're
Lord.
going to Paul.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Well, while you were talking, I was thinking how the museum is a physical space. It is, and I love that you call it a shrine, and it enshrines this beloved, this sacred history. But it is also replete with the scholarship of folks like Paul and his fellow curators, which illuminates and animates this history. It is extraordinarily emotional as we worked, all of us, and Paul's one of our earliest curators on this exhibition. Each night one would go home and think of the freedom dreams of Black people, but also think of the massacres, think of the incredible violence that was meted on people who wanted to live their lives and who, after emancipation, wanted to be free. And Dr. Du Bois tells us this, and the wonderful, of course, patron saint of this, if you will, uh, uh, Paul's hero, uh, Mr. Frederick Douglass, basically asks the question, which Paul will tell you more about. But do you mean to make good to us the promises in your Constitution? And that's the question that resonates throughout the halls of the museum, throughout this exhibition, throughout the documents, throughout the artifacts. But it is both one of the most humbling and honorable things I think I've ever done. And it is one of the most moving things I've ever done. And I always think of what our founding director said, that we want to make our ancestors smile. And I would add that I want to make our ancestors proud. That it's the same people who were reviled, the same people who were murdered, who were tortured, who were beaten, whose children were killed, that we raise them up and we raise those stories up to be in if I might get slightly religious, in an almost redemptive way that says we will never forget these stories.
Hmm, thank you. Let's let's move over to Paul. We might want to the Paul and thank you, Kinshasa, because it's deeply emotional and like I said, it's intellectual work, but it's intellectual work grounded in culture and shot through with spirit every
Yeah.
step of the way. Paul, you and I'm glad that Kinshasa mentioned Frederick Douglass. One of the striking things about the in-person exhibit, of course, is that you get to see the brother being Frederick Douglass speaking to us. And that opening quote in the book, as Kinshasa said, that question now, do you mean to make good to us the promises in your Constitution? Of course, it struck me that he said your Constitution. And so in telling a story where we're trying to think of this as a nation, as opposed to a state with a lot of different nations in it, and a national memory, a kind of conversation around national memory, I wonder, as you kind of came together and orchestrated these many different voices of scholars and culture keepers around the themes of liberation and violence and repair and place and belief. Um, how do the book's essays align with the mission of the museum? We just heard Kinshasa talk some about the mission of the museum, but how do the book's essays align with the mission and it has the part of the mission to reconstruct the history of the newly freed as it disappeared around them and uplift what was forgotten. Could you talk to us about how the book and the exhibition kind of speak to the mission?
Absolutely. The story of Reconstruction, and I think we need to unpack again that question you led with is someone we'll unpack through this whole hour. I think it's the story of Reconstruction is written into the DNA of the museum, right? It's written into the DNA of the museum, and in ways that the people who first advocated for this museum in 1915, as the Lincoln Memorial was being conceptualized, as Birth of a Nation was being touted on cinema screens across the nation, those people advocated for whose history was willfully being occluded and ignored and covered up, advocated for this what became this museum. So we're very much living a Reconstruction story every day in the museum. And it's not just, it is an intellectual and scholarly story and effort, but it is one that hits on all registers. And so when Kinshasa listed what I'd like to call, what they used to call the 28 Yankees, Murderers Row, that Murderers Row of contributors to this volume, right?
Yes.
I think about how we elicited and hopefully tapped into the best kind of thinking, that married today's issues with the past. And so, I think that what we wanted to do when we're talking about what are we reconstructing or what are we reclaiming, we wanted, and we do this throughout the museum. But in this book and in this exhibit, we wanted to shine a light on the visions of freedom, on those freedom dreams Kinshasha referred to, of millions of Africans that they shared and they brought into being, right, in the decades following the Civil War. So we want to expand our knowledge of how determined, right, how brave and how visionary people were. Right, and we use Frederick Douglass to voice this. We use the poet Frances Ellen Watkins Harper to give voice to this moment in time, where in a speech she gave, right, one less known than Frederick Douglass's, but she located the nation's salvation, right? If our nation is to have a salvation, if it is to be saved, she located that saving in the 5 million people who were formerly enslaved, right? And so those people who were determined that in this moment in time, it would mean more than just an end of slavery, right? This moment in time was more than just ending slavery. It was the realization of freedom. It was the realization of freedom in the worlds of politics, right? So see the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. It was full freedom in family life, in economics, land labor, in education, in spiritual life, in cultural expression, in life, full freedom, right? And so that's one sense that we're trying to reclaim and reconstruct. And we try to do that in the book, but especially in the book, right? In the exhibit, in our museum, we recognize that this is more than just an act of recovery, right? So for this book and we talked to all of the authors about this, and I think we can go deep with our two authors here tonight. When we see this history through an African American lens, Reconstruction is not just the past. It's not just a period, but it's a process, right? What I'll call it, an action verb, and that it's bent on making America a better place, a more equitable place, a fair place, a place where maybe we will realize full freedom. And so this is an unfinished process, and we're living in it now. And this is because the resilient forces of unfreedom that were immediately at work, in the aftermath of slavery, and denying that freedom and limiting it and recreating the conditions of enslavement. And they were deeply successful in doing that work. And Kidada and Hasan are here to talk about that. But what we were trying to do was sort of say, what our museum's job is when we are looking at the world around us and we're wrestling with contemporary issues, everything from voting rights to birthright citizenship, everything from criminal justice reform to reparations, everything from this drumbeat of continued racial violence to Confederate symbols, to these myths that have been promulgated over the course of 150 years, we should realize that these are not just today's issues, that they're not unmoored from history. They're deeply rooted in that past. As Eric Foner says, these are Reconstruction issues, the legacies of liberation and the legacies of oppression and racism. And so for me, to connect this back to your question about the museum, to resurrect this, right? To revalue these stories and embrace and extend the visions of freedom begun by those whose history we bear witness to in the book, That is the greatest thing we can do in my mind. It's what gets me up every morning. It's got what framed our conversations about what this book will be. And I don't think I think it's I don't think there could be a more timely book, or one better equipped to mark this museum's 5th anniversary or 105th anniversary, depending on what timeline you're using.
Absolutely, absolutely, and it's fascinating, Paul, as you're talking. Just thinking about what some people might think is an impossible task to reconcile a narrative like that. And in a minute, when we bring in Kidada and Hasan, I mean, quoting Du Bois, who, as Kinshasa said, is a thread that runs throughout the exhibition and certainly throughout the book, distinguishing between fact and desire and passion and belief. I guess a question that I formed in my mind is, as you were talking, and I'm thinking, of course, about your favorite Frances Ellen Watkins Harper and that speech that you profiled. And by the way, you all, in the exhibition, so many primary sources. I was glad to see Martin Delaney quoted. I mean, we won't even start name dropping, but when Frances Ellen Watkins Harper says that slavery as an idea still lives, it made me think, and I want to ask you this question: is there a difference in your mind, and maybe this is a broader question, but between national redemption, the idea of saving the soul, and I'm glad you said, as she said, if the soul is to be saved, is there a difference between national redemption as a concept and freedom dreams as a concept, or for the people who were coming out of enslavement?
Yes, in a simple word, yes, I think there is a difference between those two, but it's our job, in my mind, and in our work in the museum, to yoke those two together so they cannot be separated. That right now, too often, a conversation about national redemption leaves us free to think about things like reconciliation without repair, or full knowledge of our past. And in my mind, national redemption can only, for this nation, comes with the realization of those freedom dreams. I'll leave it at that. And I think my colleagues will have much more and brilliant things to say on that regard.
We're going to bring them in. And let me tell you, man, I don't envy you. I think this museum, more than any museum in the Smithsonian network and maybe in the country, has taken up a task that is indeed about aspiration as much as anything else. And so, I mean, that's just, like you said, it's the job then to reconcile those two. And that really is, that you said a mouthful there. So of the 5 folk who have contributed chapters around the themes, Professor Glimpf, who dealt with liberation, Professor Frankie, who dealt with repair, and we actually teach her book at Howard Law School, just a remarkable meditation on reparations. Of course, our dear friend and curator, Professor Elliott, who did the piece on place, South Carolina, again, another thread that runs through. We are very fortunate tonight to have in this conversation, as we heard, Professor Kidada Williams, who wrote on violence, and Professor Hasan Jeffries, who wrote on belief. And wow, talk about reconciling two elements that are extremely difficult. Let's start, Prof, with you, Professor Williams. When you're grappling with this question of violence, so many primary sources, the Childers family, Warren Jones and them in Georgia. I mean, in making the victims' voices heard, or those Africans who were victimized, rather, how did you go about the process of identifying who you wanted to speak for themselves and through them for everyone else? And what kind of journey did they take you on as you began to listen to these ancestors speak to you and then through you to us?
I think that's a great question. And what I'll say is that they took me to the heart of this violence and to the truth in a way that I think the history of Reconstruction has erased, has silenced. They took me to the flesh and blood realities of this violence, the kinds of things that make a lot of us today uncomfortable. But what I realize is that they didn't have the option or the luxury of turning away. And they experienced this violence in a way that most of us can't even imagine. And then they had the courage to move forward in life and then to give their testimony in a variety of settings. And so, what I wanted to do was to honor what they had lived through and their courage to tell these stories. And so, for me, what that means is putting aside a lot of the distractions to really understand what they went through and what they wanted known about this violence. And so that takes you to a really dark and uncomfortable place. But we've been talking about the importance of truth and knowing what happened and then figuring out a way forward to build a more just society. And I don't think we can do that if we don't actually know not only what they thought happened to them, but how they theorized its impact on their lives and what they thought the nation owed them. And the story of Reconstruction is about that, but it's also about the nation's betrayal, the refusal to hold the real perpetrators accountable, the refusal to end the violence. And that's the story that's part of the legacy that we have to deal with today. And it's also a reality in terms of the violence that people are experiencing today. We often don't have to sit with. We've got the luxury of not having to sit with the flesh and blood realities of being at the epicenter of police killings, the epicenter of vigilante violence. And so survivors, I believe, have a lot to teach us about the realities of injustice and what we really need to do to build a more just world.
Oh, no question. And I want to, my hat again is off to you specifically for not looking away from that failure. I think of the academic Adam Faircloth, who wrote a book, The Revolution That Failed, and he said, part of the failure of Reconstruction wasn't on the people of African descent who fought their way into a self-determination of sorts, but really was a failure of will, of the federal will. And as you write so powerfully about the failures of the federal government, whether it be after establishing the Department of Justice, the Ku Klux Klan trials in South Carolina. I mean, we're talking about voting, denial of voting rights, but these Black women and men say, no, I know I was called here to testify about that, but I want to talk about this other thing. But in the process, to what degree is the kind of continuing afterlives of this inaccurate white supremacist history of Reconstruction the result of a continuing failure of will of government, particularly to use the power of government to intervene to improve the lives of folk? I mean, is there a continuing failure of will, or is it more just kind of in the past, in the ways that you documented with regard to the federal government, the Ku Klux Klan trials, the Department of Justice, or is this something we're still grappling with today?
So I would say it's a continuing failure of will. The federal government has demonstrated great capacity to bring down movements it perceives as a threat to itself. And so we can think about Black revolutionary groups, right? The federal government is capable of actually bringing down forces it perceives as a threat. But what we see is that the reality of white supremacist violence is that the federal government doesn't really see it and perceive it as a threat. And so it doesn't treat it that way. And so it is a failure of will. But I also think that because I focus on survivors, I think that there's a larger story here, and it's about the determination of Black people, because they wouldn't have been attacked if they had just sat on their hands and did nothing, right? They make the absolute most of freedom. And the people who are targeted are the ones who are doing the most, who are making the most. And that's a story that often gets missed. And they're attacked because of that. And so that makes the injustice even more gross than it already is. And so the story of Reconstruction, the story of the violence, and the continuing legacies of violence are about two things. It's about the failure of the federal government to actually address it, and Black people's insistence on their right to be free, equal, and secure, and their refusal to let go of that. They continue to experience violence because they refuse to let go of their entitlement to those three things. And that's also that story of Reconstruction and its legacy. That Black people's dreams of freedom, their sense of their entitlement to freedom, and their willingness to fight for it.
Excellent. I'm going to ask you one more question before we turn to our brother Hasan to kind of take us home in this. And by the way, everyone watching and listening and thinking, I'm sure like you and like me, rather, you have 1,000 questions. Please start sending those questions in because we want to engage the audience as well. I want to say audience, the community, because we're in community tonight. I want to ask you one more question, Prof, and that relates to the relationship between curating the kind of primary sources, the voices that you did, and having that translate as folk read and then go to the exhibit and think through and experience, having that translate not only into learning but action. Um, how would you like to see folk who are reading what you've written, who are going through the exhibit, looking at state violence, looking at state abetted vigilantism? What kind of lessons do you want folk to learn from that engagement that could translate into action today?
What I think I'd like them to learn or to recognize is that many of the people who are targeted during Reconstruction weren't in a position of privilege to fight back and hold the nation accountable. And those of us living in the 21st century today, even with the realities in terms of the challenges of Black life, we're in a much better position to fight for justice, to build a better world, to stop people from having to continue to experience this kind of violence. And so what I hope that looking at these testimonies, understanding the realities of the world they lived in that made it much more difficult for them to join and lead and participate in campaigns that might bring about a more just world, is to understand their responsibility and the debt, what we owe to survivors, what we owe to people in the past and what we owe to people in the present. We have a debt, and we're in a much better position to actually pay it. But we have to be willing to do that. We can't just sort of, it's not magically going to happen. And these people who are targeted knew that. But we're in a much better position to take action that they couldn't.
That's a very heavy responsibility, but also encouraging with that ancestral force. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Williams. Brother Hasan Jeffries, my brother.
Yes, sir.
I was reading your essay, man, and I couldn't help because you took on belief. And so I thought about Stephen Morris from Saginaw, Michigan, the great Stevie Wonder. When you believe in things you don't understand, you suffer. And so my question, when you include Du Bois, man, I mean, you bring him home. He began at the beginning and he comes through with Black Reconstruction. And that quote, "We have spoiled and misconceived the position of the historian. If we are going in the future to be able to use human experience for the guidance of mankind, we have got to clearly distinguish between fact and desire." Professor Jeffries, as someone who, I don't know if there's anybody in the country who does any more work on teaching hard history as you do, what does it mean when you think of Reconstruction, as Paul said earlier, as an action verb? I mean, the legacy of belief, how do you reconcile that with that telling the truth, with the fact that when you're building a nation, sometimes it involves the violence of forgetting, the editing out of certain things that might keep people at each other's throats perpetually? I mean, how did you grapple with that in writing about belief?
Well, I think the first thing is that we have to acknowledge that there is some purposeful historical amnesia going on. And the purposeful is important. We have to underline and underscore that because it speaks and reflects what Du Bois was talking about, distinguishing between desire and fact. There was desire among former Confederates, those who worshiped and celebrated the institution of slavery, and those who fought and died to preserve the institution of slavery, to reimagine and reconfigure and reinterpret what Reconstruction was. And so here we see the daughters of the Confederacy in particular sort of leading this charge to rewrite, to reimagine, to reconfigure what Reconstruction was. And so if you fast forward from their high point, early 20th century, first couple of decades there, where they are literally putting into schools this false narrative of the past, when they are censoring books up to and through the 1970s, our inability today to reconcile fully with what happened in the past is not simply because we forgot to pay attention. It's because a false narrative was purposefully put out there. And that speaks to this notion of belief. When we think about the two sides of the color line, if we can go binary for just 1 second, that on the white side of the color line, the belief has not been in fact. It's been rooted in this idea of desire, and the desire to promote white supremacy and maintain white supremacy, the principal legacy of the institution of slavery. Slavery ends, but the belief in white supremacy, the belief in an enslaver mentality persists. And we have to juxtapose that with what African Americans were doing on the other side of the color line. And that was believing in the truth and trying to get the truth taught into classes. This is what Du Bois is wrestling with in the 1930s. He's like, we're trying to deal with facts, and y'all out here dealing with fiction and fantasy. And so those two have been in constant tension. And this isn't just something that occurs in the 1920s, 19 teens and 1920s, when the United Daughters of Confederacy are littering the landscape with these trophies, participation trophies, if you will. We're dealing with this right now, when you have those who are these anti-critical race theory folk. What they are fighting against this fact, because they want to, because of their desire to maintain the privileges that come along with whiteness, not only in the present, but the way in which you maintain that in the present is by denying the reality of the way in which white supremacy and whiteness has operated for the last 150 years.
Brother, yes, no question. I mean, as you write and put those things in conversation with each other, the way that the academics have written, the way that it's been framed politically, and then the rituals, the totems, the shrines, the icons, that bind these false narratives. Writing about the UDC, as you say, United Daughters of the Confederacy, you talk about a first and second wave of memorials, and I'm wondering, particularly as you integrate the conversation about flags, the whole conversation, the fight in the South Carolina State House. I think we probably all stayed up all night and watched that debate they had that led to the flag coming down. Bree Newsom, of course, is included. I think about a brother who for many years tried to get at that flag. His nickname was Reverend E.X. Slave. He used to stand across from the South Carolina State House in Columbia with a ladder, and the police had to watch him because he tried to burn that flag so many times. But brother, I wonder if, and I think about this in the context of the Smithsonian, because the Museum of the American Indian tells a certain story, the NMAAHC tells a story, and in the summer, pre-COVID, you would see a lot of times young people through there, and you see so many of these red caps on the mall. Make America Great Again caps. I wonder, is it possible that we might be living in a third wave of memorials, except these memorials, false memorials, may be portable. They may be totems. They may be in the symbols we see, the flags, the things that we saw in the Summer of Reckoning, not just for those who wanted social justice, but for those who perhaps want to cling to that myth making. I mean, how do we grapple with the question of memorials, particularly when there's the move now to get rid of them? You write so beautifully about Richmond, for example. I mean, should they all be erased? Is there a threat there? I mean, have they just transmuted to other types of memorials? What do you think about that?
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And I think I like it so much because it actually connects memorialization to white supremacy together over time. In other words, you're absolutely right. We have seen, and we talk about these two high points of memorialization to white supremacy, that first wave led by the UDC at the turn of the 20th century. And this is when we see most of those Confederate monuments being propagated and spread around. But then we don't talk about the ways in which we're actually dealing with educational indoctrination in these lies and beliefs, because the UDC is also sending hundreds of portraits of Confederate generals to public schools, saying, hang these on the wall, hang these on your walls, sending Confederate flags, saying, hang these and hand these out to children. So we see that first wave that is designed to really reinforce and say that this is a white man's country, emphasis on the man, emphasis on the white. And this is early 20th century. Then we see that second wave connected in response to the civil rights movement in the 50s and the 60s. This is when South Carolina says we're gonna fly the stars and bars. We're gonna let you know that this is still a white man's country. This is still about white supremacy. And then you're absolutely right. because after 1965, we move into what this sort of this myth of color blindness, right? The mythology of color blindness. And so now we're certainly not post-racial, but we are in this colorblind racism reality. So it's about signaling. And so the red hat signals that we're still trying to cling to this white privilege. We're still trying to cling to this white supremacy. The Gadsden flag, don't tread on me, is about signaling that this is about white supremacy. This is about maintaining whiteness and the privileges that align with it. And the real danger to that, of course, as Kidada had pointed out in the book, is that where white supremacy goes, funerals follow. That this has historically been maintained by violence. And so it's not just an intellectual exercise. This isn't just simply a difference of opinion. This is maintaining a system that is fundamentally anchored in racial terrorism and racial violence. And if we want to extend it out, because when we're talking about Reconstruction, we are talking about democracy and building democracy and making a multiracial democracy. And we know one thing, if we know nothing else from history, and certainly from Reconstruction and the fight to stop the inclusion of African Americans in this broader democratic experiment, is that the principal threat to white supremacy is a multiracial democracy. That's what brought all those folk on January 6th to the nation's capital, right? The principal threat to democracy to white supremacy is a multiracial democracy. But the flip side, we also have learned from history that the principal threat to a multiracial democracy is white supremacy. And that's why this isn't just a matter of people with views that we would like to think are out of step, that those views and beliefs, once they are empowered by those in power, can really undermine what we have at least rhetorically aspired to as a nation.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you, brother. And that's that had the fire of a sermon at the same time that it was very didactic. So the Jeremy was present, brother. So and for everybody watching, we did not plan any of these answers or conversation. This is a very organic conversation. And so this first question that is coming from the folk who have been participating by listening and now will begin to speak was not vetted. It just came out. And so it's so interesting because it dovetails perfectly with what you just said, Hasan. And this is for anyone if you want to answer. Someone asks, how can we encourage groups outside the Black community in the United States to study Reconstruction when there is so much opposition to critical race theory?
One of the things I think that we do at this museum, and that these brilliant professors and their colleagues who do, is they teach all students, I believe. I believe that they teach all and every student. They take all comers, right? And that's one of the places where we can most have promise. Those universities that have professors like these folk, right? And that also have folks like Professor Frankie and Professor Crenshaw that are in the midst of people like Tavolia Glim, Spencer Crew. That means you have that. This museum in our education programs, our whole goal of the education program is to help create a more just society. So exactly what Hasan said, a multiracial democracy. That's really the goal of our education program. And we get folk from every kind of background coming, because part of the continuing lie, my friends, I would say, is the notion, not in this speaker at all, but in the media, that somehow the quest for Black agency is a Black quest. The quest for Black agency is a human quest. Yes. So when both professors talk, when I thought of the great work that Miss Professor Williams has done with the hashtag Charleston syllabus with another great professor, Chad Williams, and I think of Bloody Lounge and the great work that Professor Jeffries does in connecting the story of SNCC to our historical stories. Every time these stories are told, there's somebody listening. There's somebody listening, and it ain't just Black folks that are listening.
Yes. In fact, let me move this up. Well, no, go ahead, jump in. I thought somebody wanted to say, Paul, you about to say something?
No, go on. I think Kinshasha said it all. The Black freedom struggle is a fulcrum and an engine for freedom struggles writ large. And it has been for a long time. So, and on our museum, like these universities, it speaks to all people. I think that's essential. That that the audiences have to be as diverse and as wide as possible.
Absolutely.
Simple as that.
The second question to come in, and thank you, Deirdre, for making sure we have the questions in a seamless flow here. This is a short question. Oh Lord, but it's kind of here's the question. Can any address what is the quote promise, end quote, and for whom? Sorry, I didn't answer. Whoever asked that question looking at everybody like, okay, who's gonna take this one?
You know, this is a sign. That's a tough one, and I can't wait to hear what Paul has to say.
Well played, sir.
Well played. Well played. See, this is how the conversations often went. You know, I wish I could channel Frederick Douglass right now. I think the key that we need to think about, right, is what I'm going to kick it back to Dr. Jeffries and say what he said. The professed values of our nation's founding documents. I think that's one smart place to start when we think about promise, when we think about in the context of what Frederick Douglass is talking about. But I think when we want to construct a conversation about make good the promises, right? I think we can channel Frederick Douglass and we can talk about the professed values that were expressed within the founding documents, that were ratified into the potential of an interracial, multiracial democracy particularly through the 14th and 15th Amendments, right? But I do think that it goes wider than just a story of democracy, and I will leave it there and let others chime in if they want.
Can I say one little thing that notion of the promise? One of the things, and we do it in our museum, Paul, don't we? One of the things that Black folk have said throughout history is challenging. It wasn't just Brother Douglass. Challenging. Mrs. Fannie Lou Hamer said, I question America, land of the free and home of the brave, right? You know about that, Brother Bloody Lowndes, brother. Come on now. You know what that's about. And basically, all of those folks whose testimonies Dr. Williams and others in this book put forward, Black people bring America to answer for what they said. Dr. King did it in 1963. He talked about the promissory note. That's correct? Yeah. So that is one of the most robust and the most strategic way that Black folks and all of our allies, Mr. Garrison, Jack Greenberg, whomever they were, have used to say, come on, America, look in the mirror. Isn't that what Brother John Hope Franklin talked about? Mirror on America. Look in the mirror.
No question about it.
Go ahead, brother.
No. Go ahead, brother. We're good on time. Please.
Okay.
Please. Yes, sir.
I'll just say real quick. And everyone who spoke to the promise, right, spoke about over the years, right? I mean, from David Walker to the present, to Reverend Barber, there's an understanding that putting it into context means that these are the words that are on paper, and we're not going to divorce those from the historical context. The historical context says that we understand, Mr. Jefferson, that when you wrote these, you did not have in mind Black folk. You did not have in mind a multiracial democracy. In fact, you built the University of Virginia as a training ground for a white master class. You weren't thinking about a democratic institution, and that institution remained segregated up until 1970. And so we understand where this came from, but you done messed up when you put it on paper. Right. Because Black folk have been using that language because you put it down. This is the highest law in the land. You said it, liberty. So now we are going to reinterpret it. Allies are going to reinterpret it. Women are going to reinterpret it, because that is now the promise for the time. And then when we put in the 13th and the 14th and the 15th Amendment and the 19th Amendment, now we're getting closer. Now we've collectively agreed what these terms are going to mean and are going to apply, and who they're going to apply to. And so the struggle then becomes, making that promise that we are now redefining, because you put it down. We can't erase it now. No take backs. No take backs. We are going to redefine it. And that becomes the promise in making, right? And evolving. But we're going to hold you to the words that you wrote.
Oh, that's beautiful,
That's right.
brother.
Yes,
deep
making is the operative word along with promise.
Yes.
I think that, and I think that the key is for as we're remaking and reconstructing these conversations, I think it's also important to remember that this question of making good the promises is not just limited to our national borders. It is, again, getting back to this idea that folks in Reconstruction, Black folks in Reconstruction, connected their visions of full freedom to visions to Black folks in other places in the world. Similarly, this conversation is rooted in these national and constitutional documents, but it is not limited to them. And I think that is another sort of area where we need to sort of have a more fully embodied conversation. And I think that because that too, that floating signifier of white supremacy that Hasan Jeffries so elegantly articulated is also one that has never stopped at our national border. It is one that is also sort of promulgating itself throughout the world. And so these are important questions, and they're deeply, deeply important to America, but they do not stop at our nation's borders or in our national documents.
Absolutely. And I just want to stop here for those, when you visit, you will see this very theme in the exhibit. It reminds me of the great Henry McNeil Turner, who was no stranger to looking beyond the borders, looking anywhere for allies. And that quote that's in the book and in the exhibit, I hold that I'm a member of this body. Therefore, sir, I shall neither fawn nor cringe before any party, nor stoop to beg for my rights.
That's right.
At the same time as he did it at the Georgia legislature, we know the AME Church was establishing itself in South Africa and West Africa, among other places. So as you say, I mean, an appropriate, Paul, given your work with the study of global slavery, to talk about global emancipation. And of course, we know that Haiti plays a role. All of it's in the exhibit, y'all. Dr. Williams, the people want to know, when and what can we expect from season 2 of Seizing Freedom? The people have asked this question. The people want to know.
Well, I can tell the people that we're coming forward into Jim Crow. So we're looking at how African Americans are seizing freedom at the turn of the century. We're telling unique stories. We're trying to provide like extensive coverage. But I think the audience will really enjoy the story that we tell coming forward.
For those who do not know, can you just tell everybody what Seizing Freedom is?
Sure. Seizing Freedom is a podcast. It's a docudrama, a history docudrama that tells the story of African Americans seizing freedom from the Civil War coming forward. And we use voices from the archives, the stories that African Americans told, their testimonies, their letters, their speeches, their diaries, to tell that story.
Excellent. Excellent.
And it's amazing.
Oh, no question. Absolutely. Brilliant work. I usually get mine coming from the Zen education folk, these teachers. What a resource. In fact, I'm going to ask one more question, and then we'll move to close. And this question actually kind of works well, Professor Williams, with what you just said in terms of the archive you draw from to put together the narratives. Someone asks, I've read many wonderful nonfiction texts about this period in history. Are there any good historical fiction? Is there any good historical fiction set during Reconstruction?
Oh, there's a lot. I would say J. California Cooper's The Wake of the Wind, Dolan Perkins Valdez, she's got a novel on Balm. There's a very extensive list of historical fiction about Reconstruction, and it's all lovely and amazing.
Let me just simply add, Toni Morrison's Beloved is a Reconstruction novel, right? And then going back into the period itself as well, Dr. Williams, right? Charles Chestnut. Well, I mean, so this is a rich period that, again, as people don't tend to think of as Reconstruction.
Yes. Okay, that's the archive is deep, and of course we know that at the museum includes a very important archive of its own and a library and a research center, which is important. So when you visit, make sure after you've left the Reconstruction exhibit to really spend some time on every floor of the museum and understand those resources, and go to the website and really explore. So prepare yourself to visit. Well, we're almost at time for summation. There are a couple more questions, but I want to make sure we're mindful of the time. Why don't we go around and everyone maybe have a chance to give a minute or two of closing remarks. We'll start with Professor Jeffries, then we'll go to Professor Williams, and then we'll go to Brother Gardullo, and we will leave the last word to our sister, the Deputy Director, Kinshasha Holman Conwill.
Well, I have to begin by just saying thank you to Paul and Kinshasha, for not just being the coach for the Murderers Row, these hard-hitting sluggers who they brought together, but really being co-conductors of an orchestra, because they created the arrangement. They knew where the pieces were going to be, so that all of the essays in the book, so that we see in the exhibition that it just flows, the pieces just flow together. There's a certain harmony to it that is just wonderful to see. And as a contributor, just playing my little instrument, I don't get to see the full piece until it is played. And then when you realize that it's all put together so wonderfully, it is really just fantastic. So thank you so much. And in seeing that and having gone through the exhibit and having been a part of the book, I can testify to the fact that no little white children were harmed in the production of either the exhibit or the book. So when we're thinking about sort of all this anti-critical race theory hysteria, we can relax, right? Learning about the past is not the problem, right? You're talking about race and teaching about race is not the problem. When you discriminate against people on the basis of race, it is a problem. When you look the other way, when discrimination is occurring and is allowed to be perpetuated through systems and structures, that's the problem. We all need to spend time with the material. We all need to spend time, especially with Reconstruction in this moment, where we're at, in this moment that we are in today, where democracy, how fragile it is, as imperfect as it is, and knowing how fragile it is, we're really at a decisive moment. And we can look back to learn some lessons to help us move forward. But if we turned a blind eye to the past, I'm afraid that we will all suffer going forward. So just thank you for the opportunity to participate in this project in some small way, because it is as relevant today as it ever was.
Thank you, brother. Thank you, brother. Please, Professor Williams. Yes, ma'am.
So I want to echo Hasan's thank you to the team for bringing us together for this project. It's been a wonderful experience. I also want to remind everyone that we're in the sesquicentennial of Reconstruction. The Civil War's 150th anniversary went marked. Reconstruction has gone unmarked, except for the fact that we've got a proliferation of incredible resources like Make Good the Promises, both the book and the exhibit. And there are resources that have been produced by a variety of institutions across the country so that more of us can actually learn this history and the ways that what happens when we don't act in good faith to protect our democracy. And the reasons why our democracy is at risk today is for similar reasons as it was back then. But we won't know that unless we do a better job of teaching it. And so I implore the audience to visit the exhibit, but also to take advantage of all of the great resources that have been made available, because part of the problem with Reconstruction is that it's been so poorly taught. And I haven't gone like much political, but I also want to say that for parents and for activists and for teachers who are really concerned about better, accurate history, they need to be getting on the school boards, because school boards play a significant role in shaping what's taught and what's not taught. And a lot of the people who want to deny this history of Reconstruction, who want to shut down, quote unquote, critical race theory, have mobilized and moved directly to the school boards to shape the larger history and the knowledge that people can gain about this era and the world we live in. So thank you.
Thank you, sis. Thank you, Prophet. Yes.
Wow. This has been an incredible conversation. I want to do this again. I'm ready to go, y'all. I want to say thank you. I want to say two things. First, I want to say thank you to you all tonight. I want to say particular thanks to Dr. Jeffries and to Dr. Williams for the wonderful, wonderful exchanges and learning and calls that we made as we were writing this book. And I want to thank Kinshasha most of all. Kinshasha was grounded me, reminded me of the value and the importance and the power of the history that we were holding and trying to make good around. So thank you, Kinshasha. The last thing I want to say is what we've done here is we now are talking about an archive, right? In an expansive way. An archive that is rooted in the past but connected to our present. That is partially on paper, that is long forgotten, that is written on the landscape, that is out there in our lives. Live in that archive. Use that archive that expanded archive to root these conversations in a truthful way, in a fact-finding way, in ways that can actually make change. So thanks.
Thank you, Brother Paul.
I want to thank Paul Gardullo, aka my brother from another mother. This has been extraordinary journey. I want to thank Kidada Williams and Hasan Jeffries for making good on your promise to deliver some of the most amazing essays in this great conversation, and all of your fellow authors. I want to thank Brother Greg Carr, because I hope he now thinks that I am ready for the revolution after today, because I promise him that every time. But I want to leave you all, and I do want to thank two other people. I want to thank Tracy Sherrard, our publisher, and I want to thank Amnesia Press, a press that was started by an African American man, Charles Harris, who came first out of HU. You know that, Greg Carr. And I want to also thank Carolyn Gleason at the Smithsonian, who really shepherded this. And little shout out to the Zen Education Project, who follows all of our work. And I want to leave you with some words of a poet, one of Paul's favorite poets. The Daughters of the Confederacy has placed a plaque here at the fort's entrance. Each Confederate soldier's name raised hard in bronze, no names carved for the native guards, 2nd Regiment, Union men, black phalanx. What is monument to their legacy? Miss Trethaway asks in Elegy for the Native Guard. This is a monument to the legacy of the Black freedom struggle, and you all are our compatriots, and I thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, and buy the book, folks.
No question. We got to do
two-
the obligatory
please-
Zoom book hold up, right?
Yes, right. And please come to the museum to see the exhibition.
Indeed, indeed. Well, thank you all for the honor of rolling with y'all one more time. When you're in DC, you must go to the National Museum. I suppose, Paul, we may even say the International Museum of African American History and Culture is a global entity, and get this book by all means. And everybody have a good, wherever you are, whatever time zone, evening, morning, afternoon.
Yes.
And we look forward to the next time we are
Yes.
convening for conversation. Thanks, everybody.
Oh, and thank Deirdre.
Oh, Deirdre, of course. Yes. Deirdre, thank you for being the point guard. No question. And
Yes.
Keith Madden,
Deirdre and
thank you,
Keith.
brother, for keeping us going. Yes, sir. No question.